Devils gathered in their masses, just like witches at black masses. Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction. In the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning. Death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh Lord, yeah. Darkness, world stops turning, ashes where the body's burning. No more war pigs have the power, and as God has struck the hour, day of judgment God is calling. On the knees the war pigs crawling, begging mercies for the sins. Satan laughing spreads his wings. Oh Lord, yeah.
that right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Sociology of War. Here we are again. I see a little child in the background. What are you doing back there? So here we are again, and we'll get started right away. I got to learn how to turn off my own music here. Hold on. All right, good. So first things first, I guess we should start off with if anyone has any questions to begin the day. So we'll start there. Any questions about the syllabus, the assignments you did over the week, content, anything? And remember, you can use the chat function over here. If you click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen, you can type in questions throughout the discussion today, the lecture and discussion, and ask me questions as we go along. Or you can chime in by just opening up your mic and saying hello or telling me you'd like to ask a question. So be willing to do that, yeah, because I'll ask you questions too to see where you are. So any questions? Say questions a lot until you say something. No? Are we reading chapters 3 and 4 in this book this week? Yes, absolutely. You'll be working on chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3 is the military-industrial complex, and chapter 4 looks at war and social stratification. We're going to be talking about a critical analysis of war to this week, getting into some heavy topics. This is a rated R week, definitely. You'll be watching documentaries about genocide, particularly genocides that have happened all over the world. Yes, Elaine.
I think the syllabus says chapters 3 and 5.
3 and 5, okay. Let me look at the book and I'll make sure of that, yeah. But I think it's, yeah, maybe it is. I'll check and see. Yeah, but definitely chapter 3, military-industrial complex, and the chapter that's labeled war and social stratification. So I'll make sure that I clean that up. Any other questions you might have? Okay, so I have Mr. Karl Marx behind me just to keep us straight today. He's going to sit on my shoulder a little bit. He's going to be the evil devil on your shoulder today because we're going to talk about war as in a critical perspective, particularly how war is created basically to control you as well as to prop up the state. The state, and when I say the state, I'm talking about capital S, the state, meaning a nation or a country or coalition of countries. So that's important to understand. I'm not talking about little s like North Carolina. I don't mean that. So I mean the government when I say the state. So we're going to talk about that today. What we're going to do is, like I did last week, we'll go 30 minutes into lecture, take a little 2-minute, 3-minute pee break, and then do some more lecture. Towards the end of today, I will also talk about the first tactical assignment that you need to start working on if you haven't already. And making sure you make a choice. You have 2 options, and we'll talk through that today. I've also put up a little tutorial last week, so you could actually look at that too. So without any further ado, let me go ahead and share a screen with you. We're going to start with a PowerPoint today talking about the theoretical perspectives. And just so that we remember, let's see, let's stop share. I'm going to do a poll first, sorry. Let's see if you remember anything from last time. Put up a question here. This is review. Is war innate or learned? So answer that poll and we'll get started. All right, let's see what we got here. All right, so the people that voted, I did it really quickly. Mostly learn with innate triggers. That's exactly right. We are looking at the fact that war definitely comes from society, and that we're going to talk more about that today through sociology theory. But if you remember last time, we talked a lot about how psychologies try to explain war, how anthropology, as well as those sociobiologists out there that say that somehow war is innate, it's inside of us. And what we found out was that not really. What is it is the society tells us what we should fight over, what the conflict should be. And remember this one thing, which I think is probably the best thing to take away from psychological research, is that fight or flight, right? Which one are humans more likely to do? Anybody? You have to open up your mic. I can't hear you.
Flight.
Flight. Thank you. Right. We're more likely to run away because why? If it's about biology, that's the survival, right? It's not the fight. Fight puts all the risk into it. So how do we get a collection of human beings to do this if we know instinctually as well as psychologically that we don't want to participate? So that's where we're jumping off today. So let's do a screen share here and get right into it as soon as I can get my computer to react. All right. And if you guys have any problems hearing me, just let me know. Maybe there's internet problems or something to that effect. So you should be able to see a PowerPoint now. War, what is it good for? Anybody got a thumbs up for me? Tell me you can see it. All right, great. So this is going to be our discussion today about sociological theory around war, because everything we said earlier was from other social science perspectives. So we're going to talk about really a critical perspective. And when we say critical perspective, what we're talking about is someone who's critiquing how war comes about through various institutions. And that's very much a sociological argument, right? So we're going to talk a lot about money, power, and politics today and why war happens. So things that we'll cover today in this little PowerPoint slide is going to be, Max Weber's argument, a famous social scientist, sociologist from Germany back in the day, or late 1800s, early 1900s, that suggested that war happened because of organization, that as human beings we have to organize to be able to commit war, and there's several reasons why that organization happens. The second thing is that we're going to see via Karl Marx, this idea of economic and political gains that can happen because of warfare. And then we'll drill down a little bit more specific into talking about the military-industrial complex, which was not a sociologist's first words, but actually came from an American president named Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was the first to suggest that he actually admitted in his farewell address that he made a mistake. He had connected military with the industry, and there was no way of breaking that relationship. So we'll come back to that. So first things first, I think it's important for us to understand where sociology is coming from on this. This is a goofy little drawing, but here it is, and it works pretty well. First, we have to realize that there are kind of two forces in society that we have to discuss, right, when we talk about sociological theory. First is the social structure, right? The things that human beings have made to organize their lives, right? Those social structures, often if you took an intro class, there would have been probably 5 institutions that were suggested. So does anybody know what institutions I'm talking about when we talk about social structure? This is where you have to use your mic.
Would that be like the family or the home?
All right. So we got the family, big social structure. What else?
Isn't there like education?
Education can be one, and especially if it's formalized. Yep. Keep going.
Religion,
right? Religion. We'll talk about religion and its impact on war next week. What else? Forgetting 2 big ones.
Politics.
The government, right? We're going to call that the state today, right? And then economics, right? So if we think about this, like the structure out there, which is really a tied in group of folks, you can see these little lines between people here that's supposed to suggest a social network. So there's these structures that are existing of other people with lots of people in it, and they create formal and informal rules for us to live by, right? So this structure. The question is, in most sociology theories, whether that structure is controlling our behavior, or is it possible that individuals control the structure? All right, so that's a different way of looking at it. And so we have social structures. The other side of this are actors or agency, right? Individuals who are being impacted by either the structure or are organizing to change the structure. Maybe you better understand this with what's going on right now in recent Black Lives Matter, as well as the issue with the police. You see individuals now organizing, hopefully, to change the structure, right? So a lot of social theory, though, argues that the structure is very powerful. It's enabling. It gives you opportunity, right? It gives you choices, and those choices can be limited, or it can constrain those choices, right, in behavior. So for instance, if you do want to organize, are there structures that keep you from doing that, as well as structures that allow you to do that? And the answer is yes to both, right? There are structures right now enabling protest and demonstration. If you think about it, the church, community organizations, those kinds of groups. And then there are structures that now are constraining that, right? You might say law, the criminal justice system, maybe the government, right, is involved. Maybe even indirectly, the economy, right, can't afford it, right? So I just want to point out that, sociology theory is going to do a lot of this argument that social structures matter in encouraging our behavior, right? That it's not usually the other way around. In fact, the two theorists that we're talking about today with critical analysis here, Weber and Marx, would argue that structure is very powerful and it actually enables and mostly constrains our behavior, right? So we can't just do whatever we want. And if you guys notice, I keep looking like to the left. That's where your faces are. So I keep looking to make sure everybody's like looking at me and making, anyway. So this is the point, right? Structure is very powerful. It's going to shape our behaviors. And we're not going to have we're not going to have as many choices as we think. And that's going to be true when we talk about Karl Marx, right? All right. So got to go back for a minute. And we read a little bit in chapter 1 about the rise of the state, right? And remember, when we talk about the state, we're talking about organized government, a governing body of a society, right? Not all societies have a very strong state that organizes behavior, it organizes spending, whatever. But all modern states since the 1800s have developed a state in which makes decisions for the masses, right? And this state usually has a formal system of government that could be called democracy. It can be called communism. It can be called totalitarian state. All those kinds of things, right? And much of the world now today is a mix of democracy and some form of actual forceful totalitarianism, actually. Then we have a formal system of economics. Is it going to be socialism? Is it going to be capitalism? Is it going to be some other form of economics? But remember that the state controls that, right? Even when we say, we have a lot of people out there arguing that the state should have no involvement in economics. It should be free trade and free market. That just doesn't work in this society today. And it hasn't really worked in the sense of when we talk about war, if you have a formal system of government, usually that formal system is working with the economics to make a decision of whether war is necessary, right? And some way to think about the state is that the state makes a decision of whether war is possible to protect those things, the formal government and the formal economics, right? But the point is how does one build up, bolster, and protect these systems, right? How do we keep that from being taken over, changed, completely manipulated to where there's no, basically benefit of having those formal systems, right? So think of it this way. How does a society keep its capitalism going, right? Does it let it run on itself, or does it bail it out every time there's a problem, right? Or do they have to send in, the ultimate question is, do they have to send in their organized military to step in and kind of help capitalism along, or even democracy for that matter, right? Democracy. So if we think about the wars of Korea and Vietnam for the United States, they stepped in not for economic gains necessarily, but to deal with a system of formal government, that they wanted to make sure that democracy was spread, right, against the USSR, the communist states, right? And how does a state convince others to participate? How do we get the state to say, you should go and fight for their interests, right? And that's going to be important when we talk about culture. But here, we're going to talk about the political economic reasons of why they push us to fight, right? Push us citizens, if even they have that title, the people who live in their boundaries, to go and fight, right? So let's start with Weber, right? And Weber is an interesting cat. If you haven't heard of him before, I'll give you a little trash on him. Maximilian Weber was actually a patient of Sigmund Freud. You guys know who Sigmund Freud is. He married his first cousin. So he's really special. as you can see in his picture, he looks pretty depressed and worn out. That's what happens as a sociologist. That's what you end up looking like at the end. But Max Weber was basically one of the first sociologists in Europe, and had come up with various theories about how society works. Now, remember, like these modern or these kind of, they're not modern, but they are in the historical sense. These modern sociologists wanted to find out how the structure impacts our behavior. Right? Remember that relationship. They see structure as dominant, not the agency, not the individual. So when he looked at war, he compared that to the current systems of government. So in that particular time, we had the rise of democracy. We had the rise of parliaments, people voting people in to make decisions for them. And for him, that meant we had basically given a lot of rights to the state to tell us what to do, right? And to tell us how to approach behavior, right? So what is okay for us to do when it comes to economic sense? What is it okay for us to, whether to get married or not in these structures? What should religion as a structure be involved in the government, right? And so there's all this stuff about requiring us to think about how the state is controlling all these different structures. And so for him, war became kind of another way in which the structure created organized aggression and violence, right? And, you know, to kind of back this up a minute, he says, you know, in one of his philosophical debates, he says, you know, give one man a knife and how many can he kill, right? And how many will he kill by himself, right? Give an entire well-trained group a knife and give them the purpose of the state, and will there be no end, right? And his point is that, in fact, he knew at that time that genocide would be kind of the ultimate push for a state, right? If I want to grab control and want to keep my state, my politics and my economics afloat and my way of life, then what limits will I go? Is there any limits to warfare, right? So for him, it was important to understand that war was an organized event, meaning human beings had to work together for this to happen. And you can think of it just like if you think about an example of maybe World War II, where how many posters, propaganda posters, were put out about how people should contribute to the war, right? Whether it be scraps, picking up metal scraps, whether it was individuals or women actually getting the right to go to work and work as Rosie the Riveter and building various war machines, right? Riveting, she was riveting bolts onto airplanes, bombers. There was also food rationing in the sense that the state required that the United States citizens not consume as much food, and that most of that food should be saved for the armed forces and fighting in the wars. So all these different elements come into play. Now, if we go structurally, can anybody imagine what they did in the education system to make sure we were okay with war and that we would participate? How do we organize people around war in the education system? Anybody? What do you think? Propaganda, what we teach you, right? I don't know if you've taken a history class lately, but some say history is just a bunch of dates for war, right? When wars happened, right? At least when powerful dynamics shift in a society, right? When we change from one king to the next or one government to the next, right? So the education system can be propping us up right now to suggest that organized violence is a solution to conflict, right? And in fact, if you think about everything you learned in history class, that was the way things changed, was that a war happened and that changed things, right? What about the religion? What about religion as a structure that encourages us to organize and be violent? Anybody? I feel like I'm frozen. Okay, maybe nobody knows. You know what it is. Religion teaches us when violence is appropriate. And most religions say that violence will have to, it may not be its first creed. Usually the 5 major religions say peace is first. You didn't know that. Love thy neighbor. But, right, there are always buts. And so religion can get behind this organization, right? that can encourage it. But I guess the point of Weber was that, let's say we're in a rational society, a modern society in which actually the government really dictates our behaviors. So how are they going to do that, right? And the 3 points he pointed out was, first, we're going to rationalize. The state's going to tell you why you should do it and how. You got to die for something is what I put in here. And the point is that if you think about how we rationalize through government processes, for instance, in the United States, Congress must vote to decide whether we go to war or not, right, with a particular country or another country. There's also several steps involved with that rationalization to get you to think it's an appropriate rational step. Like if you think about what happened with George W. Bush and the arguments to go to war in Iraq again in 2001, and hopefully he said it ended in 2003, but we know that didn't happen. He made a lot of arguments that they had weapons of mass destruction, right? It's a rational reason we have to go and fight and die for something, right? And if we didn't get rid of those weapons of mass destruction, what was going to happen if Iraq had those? Anybody remember what he argued? Okay, turn your mic on to answer. What would happen if we didn't go to war with Iraq if they had weapons of mass destruction?
They would attack us first.
They would attack us first, or they were going to come and get us and ruin our system, right? They're going to mess up our capitalist, economic, democratic society, right? So they were going to use them against us, right? Die for something. We got to rationalize it. The next thing is bureaucracy. Like I said, with social decision making, we elect people in a democracy and a parliamentary system to make these decisions for us. We don't get that individual vote. Could you imagine if they had a national referendum on whether we would go to war or not with a country or something like that? So we've created we've created a political system, and we'll get into Karl Marx here in just a second, but we've created a political system that's supposed to represent us, right? And make these decisions for the better of all of us. But again, it's a social decision. It's 400 and some members of House, 50 members of Senate are going to make the decision for us out of 350 million people, right? And if they can't make the decision, now we have executive power where a president will just, go above that, right? And we trust that president makes good decisions, right? So, and then power creation. Who do we give the authority to? Right, to make these decisions. As I said, our Congress is often given that authority. We've given that authority also over almost unilaterally to our president, especially when he decides to, as we talked about last week, use drone strikes, or y'all are talking about this in actually your voice thread. I get that mixed up. Drone strikes as an adaptation of war. It's also a political adaptation of war, right? That we're allowing the authority of a president to go ahead and do a strategic strike versus asking Congress, right, if they could do that. So you have a lot of creation of authority there. And then stratification is the fact that we've got rank, right? There's ranks involved into who gets to make the decisions. You could imagine, think about it this way. I've had this put to me before. Imagine giving a regular American citizen the nuclear football. Does everybody know what the nuclear football is? Yeah, you know what that is? It's the briefcase that carries the nuclear codes to start a nuclear war, right? Why do we give that to the president versus just you or me or someone else walking down the street? Anybody? I love these sky.
We all chose to vote that person into office to carry that responsibility.
Right. So we're going to give that person responsibility, but that's also authority, right? That's also the ability to open the case, right? Could you imagine giving that to one of us? Do we think we're not trustworthy in pushing that button? So it's something to think about, right? Why does the president have that authority when it's really the decision by the people, right? So we start getting mixed signals, right? We start getting kind of double standards that why is a president able to make that decision versus a normal citizen, right? And I wonder if normal citizens would already nuke the world 30 times over already versus supposedly this president who's rational. And if you think about past presidents all the way back to the beginning, are they the authority when it comes to war? So why do we need a government? And I think Max Weber really argued that we need a government basically because we have now given them the authority to rule our lives, right? And that's a very bleak way of looking at society, is that the government, the state, is now in charge of our lives and our personal choices, right? So that's a weird thing to kind of swallow. And if you think about this means that social scientists argue that war is key to justifying, enforcing, and maintaining possible social stratification as well as power and authority. Weber is going to argue that it's highly bureaucratic, so there's going to be a lot of decisions made up the chain. No one person will make that decision, hopefully. And there's multiple forms and steps that have to happen. It also becomes a way to kind of enforce a system that seems to be, as Karl Marx will talk about, enforcing one particular group's interest over another. So it becomes an economic enforcer. If you think about some of the wars we've been in recently, a lot of it's been about not just the ideology of democracy, but also protecting economic interests, such as oil, right? That's always the one we point at first. But also about trade, just getting ships to come across the ocean from China can become, war can be used to make sure that those treaties and those agreements about international waters are followed. We're also going to find that war helps to define inclusion and exclusion, which is a powerful tool in the idea of inequality, right? Who is a part of our team, or who's on our side versus those on the other side, right? And we're going to see that used quite a bit in cultural ideology about war. And it's also going to kind of stem reasons why we use scapegoats. That's a word you might want to write down, that it's not on the slide, but we're going to use scapegoats for why we go to war, right? Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party argued that Jews were the reason that they lost World War I, because of their inability to effectively run a government and an army. And so that became some of the impetus as to why they made decisions that would lead ultimately to the final solution, which would lead to genocide of millions of Jews, right? Again, the state decided who was the enemy, right? And that's important to understand. The biggest enemy we've ever had, and I remember at Appalachian State when I was here, when they found Osama bin Laden, we had students out here celebrating in the streets, carrying flags, marching up to the chancellor's house, and celebrating the end of what they saw was terrorism with the death of Osama bin Laden. Well, that didn't work. We know asymmetric warfare is a little different now, but he was our common enemy, right? He was the evildoer, the excluded, right? So it's important that we're seeing that stratification, this idea of collective organization, collective violence, is going to determine who's at the top and who's at the bottom. This is a great little drawing here of kind of showing the levels of stratification. You'll notice that in the middle is actually the military that protects the higher ranking officials, whether it be the clergy, whether it be the banker or the government, from the rest of society. So we'll come back to that, right? So what about Marx, right? Capitalist wars. And Marx is going to argue quite a few things, but Karl Marx is kind of influential in this because he provides us our first keystone kind of discussion about social class and its impacts on folks, as well as how social structures such as the political economy makes a lot of decisions without our consent, really. So first he says, militarism explains as capitalist elite to defend and increase economic holdings through colonization or conquest. You heard a little bit about this in Guns, Germs, and Steel, but Marx argues that if the social structure is what it is, which is run by a few in certain institutions such as the political economy, economics, and the government, right? Then what's the purpose of the military and why do we have to support it? Well, he's saying, well, this structure sells us this idea that it's necessary. That if we don't do this, then we're going to lose resources, lose our very notion of society if we don't participate, right? And as well, he's going to argue once they're able to build a political economy that's strong to withstand economic dips and turns, then strong nations or states use war to dominate the globe, right? They're going to use it as a way to spread their ideals as well as spread their economic endeavors, right? But, you know, there's a softer side to Karl Marx, which we seem to forget. Of course, he started saying these things when he was older and is about to die, is that actually war can be used as a way to be collective resistance, struggle, you know, deal with revolutions, right? A way to get back at the structure, to change the structure. So that's important to understand that he's actually going to throw in the idea of agency a little later on. But clearly, what he first says is that the social structure out there is being run by a few elites, and those elites are making decisions about to use war that propagate what they need out of life and their encouragement of their resources, right? Not to help us all, right? It's to help. And even though that may be the way they sell it, it's all for the common good. You got to make those, you got to put those rivets in, Rosie. You got to go serve your country. But really, the economic and political benefits will not be filtered down as, what is it, Reagan economics. It will not trickle down to you the prosperity of war, right? So another person to kind of think about, we'll take a break in just a second, is the power elite, right? And this is C. Wright Mills. If you've never seen his face before, another dead white guy. But C. Wright Mills argues that, kind of takes Karl Marx's argument and goes a little bit further and says, all right, well, clearly it's not everyone who's at the top or everyone who works in those structures that makes these decisions. It's really the power elite, a group of folks, right? And this is not like my kids hear me talk about the power elite, and the first thing they say, you're talking about the Illuminati? No, I'm not talking about the Illuminati. I'm not talking about any of those weird conspiracy things. This is actual fact. This is actually research fact. That we have a cadre of folks who generally make decisions about what we're going to do economically and politically without little consent from us, other than voting them in or giving them that rank. And I would point out that Karl Marx basically saw C. Wright Mills saw three kind of groups merging together. If you look at that Venn diagram in the middle, is that you had the social upper class, what we call the 1% today. We have corporate executives, right, which, by the way, are part of that upper class, right? And then we have the policy planning network, which is really the government / military, right? All the top leaders of our government. And those folks converge on each other. And if you look at the image of the pyramid, you'll see at the top, all that kind of leads to kind of a top leader strategy, right? The corporate leaders, the political leaders, and the military leaders, and how they work together, by the way, to make decisions that are collectively good for themselves, not necessarily for a whole society, right? So if you'll notice in that, pyramid diagram, the least powerful are the people at the bottom who do all this work and plan all these things out. The middle is just an intermediary between the top, and the top's actually making most of those decisions. And so it's important to understand that for him, that top there is going to make decisions that we think are valuable because culturally we've been told they're valuable, right? And we're going to go along with it somewhat blindly because it's for the good of everyone that they make those decisions. So it's a kind of a what do we call it? It's contingent upon these individuals telling us, that's a good idea to go to war. And we then fill in the cultural reasons as to why it's a good idea. But the point is, for C. Wright Mills and for Karl Marx, is that top is the only one that will benefit from what's about to happen, right? When it goes to organized violence. Any questions about that so far? Okay, so as I promised, 2-3 minute potty break. Let's do 2-minute potty break, coffee rerun, right? We'll be back and we'll finish up some lecture, all right? Go. There you go. Where's my- All right, so people need it. We come back now. Time to come back. Ooh. Taylor, you doing all right? This would have been much better in Europe, by the way.
I have a quick question about the slide we were just on.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, man.
That bubble diagram, do you think like Donald Trump would be like right in the middle of all three bubbles?
The better examples would probably be like, well, so, let's say Donald Trump's kind of an anomaly, if I may say that. He's in that corporate community, right? At first, right? And now he was part of the upper class elite, but not in the 1%, by the way. So now he's in part of the power elite, if that makes sense, right? He's now part of that decision making, right? But at first, they weren't calling on him to sit on boards of directors and things that would have cooperated with the military and well as the government. Let me explain that a little bit more. But better examples are like Dick Cheney, George W. Bush, FDR, some of our past presidents that have been more involved with corporate decisions before they went into being part of the government. So anyway, we're back, and I was answering a question there. Hopefully you guys can see the PowerPoint again. Yes? All right, good. I do want to clarify that, we already see evidence of this, and it's clear. I mean, actually, if you took took the wealth, power, and privilege class in our department, you'd have to do basically analysis of how corporations work with the government through lobbying, right? Well, the same thing's happening with war, right? Is that what we see is this power elite of people working together, corporations, the military, generals, as well as the government, working together to make policy decisions, right? And in fact, one of the folks that tells us this first is actually Dwight D. Eisenhower, right? It's not sociologists, by the way. Sociologists pick up on this conversation. In fact, if you click on the military-industrial complex link that's on this slide, you can listen to Dwight D. Eisenhower's farewell address as president in 1961, actually apologizing to the American public about connecting, creating coalitions between corporations, the government, and the military to spend dollars, right? In fact, at that point in 1961, we actually did not spend that much on our military defense, even though we were just coming out of World War II and Korea. We were not spending as much as the rest of the world. But by the time we hit 1961, we now had so many ties between corporations gaining defense contracts to build various war products, whether it be machine guns, bullets, or bandages, that was already established. And he was afraid that that would now run our economy, right? That was his last mention. He's like, while our government wants to be, while we want our people to be free, are we going to be okay with our economy running on the fact of war, right? That we're going to have to spend trillions of dollars from now on kind of infusing money and capital into our economic system to continue to produce weapons of mass destruction, anything to do with warfare, right? So that's an interesting moment, right? And it's a 12-minute speech. I suggest you take a look at least look at the transcript and how he explains that relationship. But it's clear if you can look at this, we call it Mike, by the way, in the inner circles of academia, we call it Mike, right? Military industrial complex. And that what we see is the development of lobbying and campaigning from the defense industry, really specifically, to build up revenue through Congress to support projects, right? And eventually that becomes a way to spend money. Do we need the latest fighting technology, right? How do we argue that we need a jet like the F-35 that costs billions of dollars to build? And in fact, recently they only built, I think right now they're at 25 of these jets, and that has cost over $100 billion. Is that effective spending, right? And is that about actually carteling warfare, or are we just spending money for money's sake? Also, if you don't know this, if you've ever been in the military, everything costs a lot more for some reason. If you want to requisition a hammer to build a shit house in a war zone, that hammer right now costs you $50 military spending wise. You go to Lowe's and you can buy one for $9. What's the difference? Why does it cost so much more, right? And by the way, the military is buying thousands of hammers. They're not just buying one, right? So you would think wholesale they'd get a cheaper cost, but no, right? So why is that? Why does it cost more to buy those hammers through the military contract versus buying the hammer at Lowe's Hardware, right? And that's an interesting question. Anybody want to answer that for me? Why it costs so much difference? You guys are just full of answers today. Go ahead, anybody?
Is it because of like demand? Like supply and demand, the price.
Oh, the supply and demand argument. Good. But no, that's not it. That's not it at all. Supply and demand has nothing to do with it, actually. There are plenty of hammers, and the supply is great. And they all come from China, so who gives a shit, right? But some of them don't. But the point is that, yeah, supply and demand, that would be great if, those great capitalist principles actually applied to this. But no, we've got plenty of hammers. We don't need more hammers, right? And if it's about war, then yeah, maybe it needs to be a buildup, but it shouldn't cost more for that buildup. If you think about it, even this moment, right? You guys may have heard that Donald Trump could have enacted a law that was passed in the 50s that a president could basically declare that industry must produce equipment during wartime situation. He could have enacted that during this COVID-19 situation where he would require not getting volunteers, like Ford Motor Company volunteered to make the respirators, right? That we're so short of, and masks, right? These companies that are making masks and PPE equipment, they volunteered to that. There actually is a congressional act that says the president can declare that all industry must produce during times of war. And people have been calling this kind of a warlike situation. So Trump could have said, and by the way, you should notice that the government has given a law that says that the government can tell the industries to produce, right? And that's what they did during World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. They did not do that in this situation, right? And so he decided to let people volunteer. Interestingly enough, it wasn't really volunteer because Ford Motor Company and their lobbyists approached Trump and his executive team, what do we call them, board, and said, yes, we'd like to do this, and what can we get out of it, right? So remember that there's some backdoor stuff and we also have legislation that says he can do that, right? That he can enact this relationship between corporations and the government to supply during wartime, right? So it tells you something, right? That the laws that are set up are protecting that political economic structure via, this guy behind me, right? And by the way, will jobs be gained or lost? Because that's what it gets down to, the behavior. What will impact us, right? And so maybe jobs are gained and we go, oh, this is worth it. I'll make more hammers and I'll make more ventilators and I'll do all that because it's necessary. That's a different thing. Do I get any of the profit of it? Do I get any of the spoils of that? No, right? The American public's not going to get the spoils of that, right? Someone put, sounds like money laundering. It is kind of, right? It's moving money around. You guys have been watching the Ozark or something. It's kind of moving shale companies around, but it's not a shale company. These are companies that employ thousands of people. Halliburton was a really good example during Iraq, right? Owned by Dick Cheney on the board of executives, leads vice president. Got several millions of dollars worth of military contracts to essentially go into Iraq and rebuild its infrastructure, water, roads, right? Those are good examples, right? And why did Halliburton get it over any other company, right? Well, it's good to be the vice president, isn't it? Right? And you can make some influence there. So we see some of the corruption and scandal that even Trump has brought up, draining the swamp. The military-industrial complex kind of shows that swamp that we are so concerned with. Let me show you again. I want to show you a link to what you can use actually for one of your projects. I'll go here. Over here. This is a website dedicated to the military-industrial complex. It was created. This says the military-industrial complex was enacted on January 17th, 1963. Interestingly enough, that's about the time that JFK is elected and is president, right? So anyway, military-industrial complex, great website, but it explains to you, it also shows you the companies that are already still involved with this military-industrial complex, right? It gives us actually up-to-date information. But here's the question, before we get into this too much, is that do you think corporations should have some influence over warfare, right? Should people like Glaxo Wellcome or GE be the ones that help us decide whether we go to war or not? What do you think? Maybe I'll put up a poll. Maybe you'll believe the poll. You guys see the poll? Yep. Answer for me. Should corporations have a say over military spending? I like people who put, I don't know. It's a cop-out answer. It's such your generation. I don't care. It's not blowing me up. All right. So most of you said no, but I already told you it's entangled. So how do you untangle it? Some of you said, two people said yes, right? If anybody wants to recognize, why should they be involved? Those two folks that said that.
I think it's important especially if like companies are helping supply us with the tools that we need, and I feel like it would be more like motivating for someone to help if they actually like had a say in it rather than being like, you need to help me in this time kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like a mutual.
Yeah. So maybe it's the cooperation, right? Like corporations are doing their part. Maybe, is that what you're suggesting? Yeah. Okay. So I get that, right? We like for corporations to do their part, pay their taxes. Wait, they don't do that. They are supposed to stay here and keep their jobs so we can get them. Oh, wait, they don't do that. So why not have them influence our military ideas and military spending? So we got to think this is more critical, AKA this hairy bastard behind me, right? That what are they getting out of that? Once they cooperate, right? What are they getting? They're getting profits, right? And who's building most of that stuff? Wage earners. We could get all into this very metaphysical discussion about, the use of labor and things like that. But here's the thing to think about, right? When we think about the military industrial complex, you guys can still see the mic here. Total spending in 2016 was probably one of the higher years. It was the 10th year collecting information, but the amounts are being spent are in the trillions of dollars, and especially when we're in warfare. I think when we looked at 2006, I know that's a long time ago, 2006, we hit $1.2 trillion alone in spending towards Iraq. $1.2 trillion. You guys were worried about giving out $4 trillion for this relief on COVID-19. We were spending that yearly for 5 years during the Iraq and Afghanistan hype, right? So where's all this money going is the question, right? And how much of this money is used for actual, what I would say, boots on the ground and bullets in the chamber versus what we used to call pork barrel spending, right? Spending on development, spending on things that don't work, and things that are kind of like the $50 hammer, right? So that's an interesting thing. And it's the core critique of why are we pumping $1.2 trillion into our corporations to build these things? Because it keeps it afloat. And that's important to understand. That was Dwight D. Eisenhower's point, right, in the Mike speech here, is that it keeps our economy afloat. So anybody ever heard of the dog or the tail wagging the dog? So the tail here is the corporation telling the entire dog what to do, right? So that's pretty powerful, and it becomes a problem later on if you think about spending, especially when, by the way, military spending is not discretionary spending, it's automatic spending, meaning it must be spent by law. So let me show you another. We'll go back to the slide right quick here and get you back into the discussion here. But, you know, so people like Lockheed Martin, Halliburton, Boeing, Raytheon. Lockheed Martin you've probably heard of because they build airplanes. Boeing you've probably heard of, right? The people who had the MAX jet that messed up. Actually, you should know that Boeing's total profits are actually 75% of it is in military development. The rest are building commercial jetliners. Lockheed Martin, based out of Atlanta or outside of Atlanta, same kind of situation. Raytheon, maybe you've never heard of Raytheon, but they do all kinds of things, but most of it's about development of nuclear technologies. And then the question becomes, well, how does this, and it's called Iron Triangle, it's called Mike. So what do we see in the spending, right? And comfortable relationship is already established between these government entities and defense-minded organizations, right? In fact, you make more money as a corporation if you can find a way to sell your products to our government, right? And war profiting since World War II has skyrocketed, especially when it was established for that effort, and that hasn't really gone away. In fact, major cities exist today because of war spending and jobs, for that matter. Most of these folks hire, if we go back to the Ford Motor Company who built Sherman tanks during World War II, they hired hundreds of thousands of people to do that work. So we need them to keep our economy afloat, and now it's become a symbiotic relationship. If we try to take it away, then we're going to have economic consequences. So let us take any questions you might have. Let us, like I'm a royal us. Any questions you might have about that critical perspective? So we got one guy, Weber, says it's all organized violence. Our state is pushing us towards committing more because it needs to happen to support our state. Marx goes a little deeper and says, well, the state is probably run by a few elite folks, and those elite folks want to prop up their existence. I didn't know if I said that enough, but prop up their existence and keep their state afloat. That benefits them, but damn what it does to us. And then a little more granular, the military industrial complex and the power elite, this little cadre of folks. And by the way, he's not excluding, I would point out that C. Wright Mills doesn't exclude military generals, right? Because if you know what military generals actually do, they sit on these committees that make these decisions, right? And so, of course, they're in their best interest saying, yes, we want the best fighting technologies and those kinds of things to be available. Spend more money on us, please. Please advocate for that. And by the way, when I say defense spending, I'm not talking about the VA. The VA is a separate line item for defense spending. So We're not talking about VA. We're not talking even about the pay we give to people who are participating in the military. That's not included in that budget, right? So this is about pieces of things. Any questions before we move on? All right. So to kind of cap this out to another discussion is to talk about kind of the impacts of war on the rest of the world, and to look at social stratification a little bit more beyond just the military industrial complex, right? And you should now see a PowerPoint called Wars Around the World. And the reason I pull this up is to realize that war is definitely a common thing that is happening across the world. Most of it today is asymmetric. You learned that term probably in the first chapter about war not being necessarily organized in a concerted attack, but more terrorist involved, more cyber terrorism and those kinds of things, which makes it less organized and less of a clear enemy of the state, right? If you haven't, thought about these terms, wars in this sense are over resources, right? Power, ideals. I want democracy to spread. I want to be able to enter any agreement I want economically with other countries. I want to be able to show that I'm a superpower, right? And so all these things come into play, and they all become stratification elements, right? We already talked about colonialism. You talked about that you saw that through the guns, germs, and steel. But the idea of the development of political ideologies like democracy versus communism, right? The idea of creating treaties, coalitions, and pacts are about pooling economic and political resources to make you powerful, or to make you powerful with a set of countries. And then it really gets into some of the other things that we don't really talk about, that war has a significant stratified impact. If you didn't write that down, you should write that down. War has a significant stratified impact on the rest of us, right? And so I'm going to skip to that. The question for you would be, before we get into that, is like, who spends the most money on the military, their military today? Out of the whole world.
United States.
That's right, by 4 times much than this next person in line, which is, you might know,
China.
Russia, and then China. Damn it, right? Now China has more people involved in their military, which remember the game of Risk? Never go to a land war in China. Bad idea, right? Too many people. But economically spending, we spend almost 4 times more than the next country, and that expenditure is quite big, right? I'm going to show you. Right click before we move on. That military spending. Stop it. These things get in the way. All right, here we go. Let's see if I can show you this. Share. Come on. Faster, Cameron. Here we go. Defense spending, right? There you go. China. Oh, you're right. China. Damn, I was wrong. My statistics were old. Shit. Anyway, look who's third. Saudi Arabia. But look how much difference in spending there is, right? Between the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth. These have changed recently in 2020. We spend the max amount. And many countries argue that's why we're a superpower, right? Not just because we spend that money, but we develop some of the most advanced technologies in our military spending, right? Which we sell to everyone else, which if you haven't heard lately, Saudi Arabia just bought a bunch of our tech to support themselves, right? So let's go back to this argument of the idea of how it impacts others, right? And I just want to point this out before we get into talking about assignments. If you've got to go at 10, remember, you go, you come back and watch the re-record or the recording to find out the rest. But I just want to point out these things that really are important to understanding how it impacts the rest of us when war is made a decision based on the power elite. first thing is total war, right? And that since really for the United States, since the American Civil War and into the current era of war, is that total war is this idea that war has no boundaries, right? That civilians, children, women, cities, infrastructure such as internet, water, electricity are all fair game in this war. Now, interestingly enough, right, who's going to suffer from this the most, right? It's the civilians that need these items to be able to survive, right, and to thrive. And what we see is that total war takes in this idea of no one, everyone's a target, and they offer, and they are a threat to the state, right? So it justifies using weapons and tactics that result in significant loss of civilians through death and casualties, with no recourse for collateral damage, right? And that really what we call this after American Civil War is the scorched earth policy, right? We're going to go after everyone to break them psychologically, culturally, as well as economically and politically, right? So imagine that many of the people damaged by this are children, women, people at home versus, the idea of, just military combatants, right? So how do we see these things, right? And we know that there are indications of larger amounts of civilians dying in recent wars, right? We talk about 600 million dying in World War II. That's total with combatants. But if we take away the combatants, it's still around 550 million, right? So only, about 450 million. So only about 250 million died that were combatants in the World War II. The rest were civilians, children, right? So we had entire generations wiped out. You can see that in the current wars as well. We also see this kind of a tangent thing of who do we enlist when we run out of the competent soldiers? We go after children and elderly, right? So we enlist those folks. We make them part of it. Ethnic cleansing and genocide is another indicator of total war. Every major war has an ethnic cleansing and or genocide attached to it, which is, it's sad to say. And then when we leave these places, they're economically and politically destroyed. So when we were trying to leave Iraq, and in fact, after Vietnam, for American policy, we had to now agree to, based on UN guidelines and NATO guidelines, to rebuild places, infrastructures that we destroyed. So we've spent trillions of dollars trying to rebuild Iraq after blowing it up. There you go. And I think that's pretty powerful indication that war has a stratified impact, whether it's globally, whether it's locally. It's very much an impact on several different groups, and that groups that are not necessarily on the front lines of the war. You're going to spend a little bit of time with this for your threaded discussion this week, talking about genocide as one of those significant impacts of stratification through war. So you'll have to look at this information, but it's important to understand that genocide is a new term, relatively new term from World War II, even though it happened quite a bit before that. Now it's really very present because we now have political economies that plan these things out to the fullest extent. And then the last thing I want to suggest to you is that warfare has also, this stratification has also created this thing called terrorism, right? Thing called terrorism in the sense of today, we talk about ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, and those kinds of groups that have arisen from economic and political global domination as one way to look at it. But this is true when we look at our own American Revolution. It was an economic warfare, right? People in Boston Tea Party were tired of being taxed, right? And so they rose up against the government, right? The established government. And that's where Karl Marx's idea of collective violence might be used for revolution is necessary, right? So when we look at it that way, and I would point this out when I usually talk about this area, is that the picture you see in front of you, are those freedom fighters or are they terrorists, right? And that's important to know the distinction between that. I mean, our government has told us that they're terrorists, right? Because they're out to get our way of life and who we are. For them, they see themselves as freedom fighters. That's true with the Irish Republican Army. That's true about the PLO in Palestinian liberation. That's true with a lot of different terrorist organizations that we've labeled as terrorists, that their view is that they're freedom fighters trying to save us from total destruction and total war. So I'm going to stop with that. And anybody want to take any questions or anything like that? You'll discover more about that part as you read through chapter 5. It's not chapter 4. I need to fix that. Chapter 5 of stratification. But anybody have any questions for the lecture today before I talk about the assignment? So remember, this week you have 2 assignments that are regular. You'll have your quiz and your discussions. I really like, by the way, I'm really enjoying the voice threaded discussions. I like those better because I can actually hear you and kind of know you that way instead of just reading stuff all the time. So those have been good. I appreciate your comments. You're doing a good job. So remember, those are that is actually due by Friday, right? I'm not going to mess this up this time. That's due by Friday, and the quiz is due by Sunday. So make sure you get on that. Now, let's talk about your first tactical. Anybody have any questions about the tactical to start off with before I give you an overview? Hearing none. So this is what we got to do, or this is what you got to do. You have 2 options, right? Number 1 option for this tactical is that you do an analysis on a corporation that has connections to the military and the government and defense spending. You would do, you select a corporation. You can use that militaryindustrialcomplex.com to start your research, to pick an institution, and you're going to create a narrated PowerPoint or Google slide, which I've put some directions on how to create those things in those formats. Talking about your corporation, what money it's received from the government, what does it build, and what are the lobbying efforts to keep them afloat in the government. That's your first option. The second option we haven't really talked about yet, but we'll be talking about next week, is the cultural representations of war, right? And that is a paper in which you pick 20 media items. It can be a comic book, it can be music, it can be movies, and you analyze those movies and look for things like militarism, support of heroes, right? To tell you that being heroic is a thing you should do, and more to kind of sell it to us, right? This idea of cultural propaganda, right? And you do an analysis of those 20 items to tell me what you see. And then one of the sections of the paper is talking about whether this is propaganda or not, whether it's encouraging us to do things that we wouldn't normally do, right? So those are the 2 options that you have. And you'll need to be able to complete that, one of those by next Wednesday, midnight next Wednesday, to turn that in. So questions, comments about those assignments? Directions are online. I've done a little video tutorial about it. If you need to ask me some questions like was this media choice good? Yeah, I can answer that question, no problem. Or should I look at this corporation? Absolutely, right? I can answer those questions through email if you have them. Any questions so far about the assignment? I'm sure when it gets about Tuesday, you'll start asking me questions about how to do something, right? Let's not wait till the last minute. You won't get it done in a day. So if you do have specific questions, do email me and let me know. Any questions you might have about anything else right now? Life, liberty, the pursuit of warfare. Okay. Well, I wish you all a great week. If you need me, reach out. I'll post a recorded thing here in a minute once it downloads, and you can go back and check things if you need to. All right, guys, have a great week, and I'll be talking to you through the voice thread, hopefully. See you guys later. Yes, I can still meet after a class.
Okay.
Yeah, I got you. If you want to stay on, we can.
That worked. I'm just going to go grab my notes. I'll be right back.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. All right, see everybody else later. I'm going to talk to Ariana. All right? Have a great day.